Featured in this video are 4 towns which all have one thing in common. They once belonged to something virtually unheard of in England, a county exclave. This then is the story of not just the towns themselves, but what is surely England's most bizarre historic county border. When you think of exclaves, i.e. areas of land detached from the mainland of the same territory to which they belong, chances are you think of Alaska or Kaliningrad. It's less likely that you might think of Lancashire. Nevertheless, a little over 50 years ago, this was the case for our 4 towns in question. So here's Lancashire as it appears today. On the 1st of April 1974, several major county border shifts were implemented all across Britain, and it was Lancashire that arguably underwent the most radical change. What do I mean? Well, here's how it looked before. Now there's plenty to discuss here, but for the purpose of this video, we'll stick to the Northern Exclave. What became of it, and how did it come to be in the first place? Well, let's dive straight in. We start this virtual tour with the most historic of the 4 main towns in the area, the town of Dalton-in-Furness. This market town is situated just under 2 miles away from what was once the second richest Cistercian abbey in England. Founded in 1123 by the then future King Stephen, Furness Abbey would become second only to Fountains Abbey near Ripon in terms of Cistercian wealth. As for the town itself, its geographic location in a narrow inland valley is said to have been deliberate, so as to be safer from raiders from the sea. The 14th century tower of Dalton Castle stands as a reminder to past threats, not just from the waters, but from the Scots, who were frequent visitors to northern England during this period, perhaps still fuming at losing Carlisle to the English shortly after the Norman conquest. Those familiar with Tudor history will already know the fate of Furness Abbey, which is to say, it was destroyed by Henry VIII during the dissolution of the monasteries. This diminished Dalton's role as a powerhouse of the region, although it wasn't until several centuries later still that it was eventually eclipsed in size by its neighbour, just 3 miles to the southwest, Barrow-in-Furness. The shared suffix between the 2 towns refers to the Furness Peninsula. Furness is suspected to derive from an Old Norse word for headland, while Barrow is said to be Norse for bare island. That's bare as in empty, not the animal. The Vikings are believed to have come ashore here, and place names, along with various Viking archaeological discoveries across the peninsula, give strong credence to this being the case. One thing's for sure, Barrow-in-Furness is one of England's biggest geographical anomalies. How did a town with a population of over 55,000 today come to be in a spot as remote as this? Well, back in medieval times, this area was a grange of Furness Abbey. After the Reformation, it remained little more than a collection of farmhouses for the next 3 centuries. So what brought about its dramatic change? In a word, hematite. This high-grade iron ore was discovered in large deposits here in 1850 by industrialist Henry Schneider. Having already established the Furness Railway 4 years prior to this with the backing of fellow industrialist James Ramsden, Schneider was right on track, so to speak, to bringing about a major transformation to the area. A series of iron and steel works sprung up in the decades that followed. At its peak, Barrow-in-Furness had gained the nickname English Chicago. James Ramsden became its first mayor in 1867, and the town diversified into shipbuilding, launching its first ship in 1873, and by 1886 it had launched the first of one specific vehicle for which the town is most closely associated today, the submarine. Whilst the vessels may have been underwater, the town was anything but at this stage. As if to emphasise its dominance in the late Victorian period, Barrow Town Hall was constructed in the 1880s. Standing proud at 50 metres tall, this red sandstone masterpiece took a staggeringly short 4 years to build. To any Manchester residents watching, are you beginning to feel cheated yet? Anyway, just a few years later, 8 miles northeast of Barrow, at the opposite end of the Furness Peninsula, a star was born. Quite literally. The town is Ulverston. The year was 1890, and the man was Arthur Stanley Jefferson, better known as Stan Laurel. Now, it may come as a surprise that a member of Hollywood's first generation of superstars came from humble beginnings in one of the most geographically improbable corners of England. But prior to taking a steamship to America in 1910 and getting Oliver Hardy into various nice messes, this was the town he called home. A market town since 1280, when Edward I granted it a royal charter, Ulverston took over Dalton-in-Furness's role as a centre of power in the surrounding area after Henry VIII dissolved Furness Abbey. In the 17th century, it birthed the Quaker movement, and in the 18th century, the Ulverston Canal connected the town to the Irish Sea, and by way of steamships to Liverpool, London, and parts of Scotland. Although the canal became defunct as ships grew too big for its waterways, the Furness Railway was on hand to keep Ulverston close to the heart of the iron ore trade following its arrival here in 1854. All the while, a new line of track was in its conception phase that would connect Ulverston to Lancaster, and in the process spawn a seaside resort with a difference, the town known today as Grange-over-Sands. Just east of the Furness Peninsula, but still in Lancashire historically, is the Cartmel Peninsula. This is home to just one town, the town you're looking at. Originally a small fishing village known as Grange with Kentisbank, its current name owes its origin to a frustrated vicar. In 1858, the Reverend Wilson Rigg had become fed up by having his mail constantly being misdirected to the village of Grange near Keswick, about 30 miles away, so he arranged for the town to be renamed Grange-over-Sands, in reference to the mudflats of Morecambe Bay visible at low tide. This helped to promote its seaside location to holiday-making Victorians who had become particularly fond of taking the waters, but at the same time not providing false advertising. Due to its extremely tidal nature, depending on when you visit, there's a chance you might barely even see the sea at all here. But what you will see regardless is a town with all the splendour of a Victorian spa resort. The Edwardians called it the Torquay of the North. This is in fact a poignant example of what many seaside towns might look like today had it not been for the Second World War. With no heavy industry, Grange-over-Sands was largely passed over by German bombers. One town that wasn't so lucky, however, was Barrow-in-Furness. In 1941, the Luftwaffe targeted the shipyards and steelworks of Barrow-in-Furness. 83 civilians were killed and over 11,000 houses were damaged or destroyed. The shipyard nevertheless continued to assist the war effort, but the town would never be the same. After the war, Barrow's mining and steel-making industries were already heading for decline before finally succumbing in the 1960s. Shipbuilding, on the other hand, is alive and well here, courtesy of BAE Systems submarines, who are headquartered in the town to this day. But what then of Lancashire? Well, the 1st of April 1974, the date I alluded to earlier, was when all 4 towns shown here, along with much of the surrounding area, entered into a brand new county, Cumbria. This formed as an amalgamation of the historic counties of Cumberland, Westmorland, a tiny sliver of Yorkshire, and of course our subject matter, the Furness and Cartmel peninsulas, which historically belonged to Lancashire. The more pressing question, perhaps, is not what happened to Lancashire's borders, but how were they once this unusual in the first place? Well, the answer can be boiled down to 2 main factors. The first being the area's 2 main religious institutions prior to the Reformation, namely Furness Abbey and Cartmel Priory, and the second being the unusually tidal nature of Morecambe Bay. Traditionally, Lancashire is one of 3 counties palatine of England, the other 2 being Cheshire and County Durham. These were counties with some degree of autonomy over the crown. This meant that Furness Abbey and Cartmel Priory, and the land owned by the two respectively, were beholden to Lancashire rather than Cumberland or Westmoreland. The collective area became known as the Liberty of Furness, which was established concurrently with Furness Abbey and granted to the Duchy of Lancaster. As such, it was able to survive the Reformation as part of the County Palatine of Lancaster, leaving with it the quirk of being cut off by a small part of Westmoreland along Morecambe Bay. Not a recent phenomenon either, as John Speed's map from 1610 will attest to. There is an additional quirk in that it could be argued that this isn't a true exclave after all, because at extremely low tide at specific times of the year, it is possible to cross Morecambe Bay on foot with the aid of an experienced guide known as the King's Guide to the Sands, formerly the Queen's Guide to the Sands. But to all practical intents and purposes, this was England's most significant county exclave prior to the formation of Cumbria. In terms of identity, though, many would argue that the towns featured here are still very much part of Lancashire. Even in the farthest flung corners of Bower and Furness, the local accent is very much Lancastrian, whereas by contrast, go to Carlisle and the local twang becomes all but indistinguishable from Newcastle, despite both now belonging to Cumbria. At the risk of stating the obvious, local dialects don't observe county border changes from 1974. And speaking of Cumbria, this is a county that famously has a monopoly on the Lake District, extremely popular with tourists and deservedly so, but it has left its southern coast as something of a forgotten gem. A forgotten gem over sands, you could say. Thanks for watching and have a great day.